The official account of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 is a story of reform. A crusading journalist publishes a book. The public is outraged. Congress acts. The president signs the law. Contaminated food disappears from American shelves, and the modern regulatory state is born in a single legislative stroke. That is the version preserved in school curricula and commemorated on government websites. What it omits is the industry that wrote the terms of its own regulation, the political apparatus that turned public horror into a law calibrated to protect market dominance rather than eliminate the conditions that had produced the horror in the first place, and the decades of institutional suppression that preceded the act, during which the federal government possessed both the knowledge and the authority to act, and chose, with consistency and deliberation, not to do so. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What the standard account cannot explain is why 190 food safety bills failed in Congress between 1879 and 1905, and why the one that finally passed was written in rooms where the men most threatened by it were also the men with the most direct access to the drafting table. The answer is not in the legislative calendar. It is in the financial record of who held the access and what they paid for it. To understand what American consumers were actually eating before 1906, the record must be read at the level of the product, not the politics. The processed food industry in the United States had expanded at a rate that bore no relationship to any corresponding advance in safety or quality control. Between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the century, the industrialization of the food supply proceeded with the same logic that governed the industrialization of steel or coal: volume, margin, and the elimination of any cost that did not directly contribute to profit. The difference was that the cost being eliminated was frequently the difference between a product that was inert and one that was actively dangerous. The infrastructure of distribution, which by the 1880s extended through a national railroad network capable of moving canned, packaged, and processed goods across state lines in quantities and at speeds that no prior generation of American consumer had experienced, meant that a product formulated in Chicago could reach a family in Baltimore or St. Louis before any symptom of harm had time to develop and be connected to its source. Adulteration was not marginal. It was the operating standard of entire product categories. Milk, which occupied a central place in the diet of urban families and was considered essential for infant nutrition, was routinely cut with water and then re-whitened with chalk or plaster of Paris to restore its opacity. To extend shelf life, formaldehyde was added, a compound whose role in embalming was well understood by the period's pharmacists and physicians, and whose effects on living tissue were no less severe when delivered in a bottle than in a mortuary. The compound was sold commercially under the trade name preservaline, and dairy processors purchased it in bulk from chemical suppliers who did not inquire into its application. In cities like New York and Chicago, where the distance between rural dairy production and urban consumption had stretched to the point where unrefrigerated milk arrived already partially spoiled, formaldehyde was not an aberration among disreputable operators. It was a standard input among established ones. The infant mortality rates in American cities during the 1880s and 90s tracked closely with the summer months, because summer was when unrefrigerated milk spoiled fastest and formaldehyde concentrations climbed in direct proportion to the spoilage being masked. The connection between adulterated milk and infant death was documented in municipal health reports produced by the same cities whose dairy processors were producing the adulterated milk. The reports were filed with city health boards. The practice continued. Butter presented a different problem with a similar structure. Genuine dairy butter was expensive to produce, dependent on the cream content of the milk supply and the labor-intensive process of churning. Oleomargarine, a product derived from beef fat, lard, and vegetable oils, could be manufactured at a fraction of the cost and in quantities that the dairy supply could not match. The economic pressure to substitute oleomargarine for butter or to blend them without disclosure was substantial. The problem, from the processor's perspective, was that the consumer could sometimes tell the difference in color and texture. The solution was dye. Yellow coloring agents derived from annatto or artificial sources were added to oleomargarine to make it visually indistinguishable from dairy butter, and the product was then sold at prices that implied the real article. The Oleomargarine Act of 1886 imposed a federal tax on the product and required disclosure, but enforcement was inconsistent. The interstate shipment of undisclosed substitutes continued for years after the tax was established, and the financial advantage of the substitution remained substantial enough to sustain the practice against imperfect enforcement. Canned goods operated under a separate chemistry with a common logic. The canning process, executed correctly, produced a shelf-stable product that preserved nutritional value across the distances that separated production from consumption. Executed under pressure to reduce processing cost and conceal the effects of that pressure, it produced something the label did not describe. Copper sulfate was added to canned peas, green beans, and other vegetables to restore the bright green color that heat processing had destroyed. Because a can of gray-green peas did not move from a grocer's shelf, and a can of vivid green peas did. The copper sulfate restored the visual signal of freshness to a product from which the actual freshness had been cooked away. Borax and boric acid were used as preservatives in canned and processed meat products, not because they were demonstrated to be safe at the concentrations required to be effective, but because they suppressed the olfactory evidence of decomposition long enough to complete a distribution cycle and a sale. Sodium sulfite performed a related function in ground beef, reducing the iron compounds responsible for the browning of exposed meat surface and restoring the red appearance that consumers associated with freshness to product that had already begun to oxidize. A pound of ground beef purchased in any American city in 1895 might reflect genuine freshness, or it might reflect the application of a reducing agent whose effect on the bacterial load it concealed was chemically nil. The consumer had no way to know which. The law provided no mechanism for finding out. The candy and confectionery industry, which by the 1880s had developed into a national market, supplied by large manufacturers shipping product through the same railroad network that carried canned goods and packaged meats, supplied its own inventory of hazards to a consumer base that included a substantial proportion of children. Lead chromate, a bright yellow compound whose lead content was well understood by the period's industrial chemists, was used in the coloring of hard candies, frosted baked goods, and decorative sugar products. Vermilion, a compound of mercury and sulfur that produced a vivid red, appeared in candy shells and confectionery coatings. Prussian blue, an iron cyanide compound, was used for blue and green colorings in products positioned specifically for children's consumption. These were not the choices of disreputable manufacturers operating at the margins of the trade. They were the standard colorants listed in the trade publications and chemical supply catalogs of the period, available to any manufacturer willing to order them, and used by manufacturers whose products were stocked by retailers in every American city. The technical capacity to produce artificial colorants from less toxic compounds existed. The economic incentive to pay the premium for safer alternatives did not, because no law required it, and no market mechanism made the harm visible at the point of purchase. Whiskey and distilled spirits occupied a particularly well-documented position in the adulteration record because the economic stakes of the fraud were high enough to support organized lobbying on multiple sides of the question, which produced a documentary record more extensive than adulteration that operated without comparable opposition. Rectified spirits, produced by redistilling cheap neutral grain alcohol and then adding coloring agents and flavoring compounds to simulate the character of aged straight whiskey, could be manufactured in weeks at a fraction of the cost of the barrel-aged product that required years to produce. Burnt sugar, tobacco extract, and prune juice were among the most common coloring agents used to give rectified spirit the amber color associated with Kentucky bourbon or rye. Fusel oils, the toxic byproducts of rapid and imperfect fermentation, were present in rectified spirits at concentrations that properly aged whiskey would have deposited out during the years of barrel contact. The headaches, the nausea, and the hepatic damage that accompanied heavy consumption of rectified product were attributed by consumers and physicians alike to the ordinary effects of alcohol excess, which provided the rectifiers with a durable and essentially unfalsifiable form of cover. The straight whiskey producers of Kentucky, Maryland, and Pennsylvania understood the distinction and its consequences, and they lobbied through the 1890s and into the 1900s for legislation that would protect the integrity of their product name. Their economic interest in this instance aligned with consumer health. The rectifiers' economic interest did not, and the rectifiers funded their opposition accordingly. The federal government possessed, through all of this, the scientific capacity to document what was happening. Harvey Washington Wiley had been appointed chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture in 1882, and within a few years of his appointment, his Bureau of Chemistry had begun systematic chemical analysis of commercially available food and drug products sold in interstate commerce. The results, published beginning in 1887 under the series title Bulletin 13, documented adulteration across virtually every category of processed food the Bureau examined. The reports named compounds, quantified concentrations, and identified product categories with a specificity that left no room for ambiguity about what the Bureau had found and what it implied. Wiley presented these findings to Congress through its relevant committees, he testified at hearings, he communicated with individual members, he wrote to the Secretary of Agriculture. The reports were not classified, not suppressed, and not disputed on scientific grounds by the industries whose products they described. They were received, acknowledged, and set aside year after year for more than 2 decades. Between 1879 and 1905, no fewer than 190 bills addressing food adulteration and drug misbranding were introduced in Congress. The record shows that not one of them passed. The obstruction was not disorganized resistance from an industry caught off guard. It followed a pattern that the lobbying record makes fully legible. The food processing industry, the patent medicine industry, the whiskey rectifiers, and the agricultural chemical manufacturers each maintained organized and funded lobbying operations in Washington. The National Food Manufacturers Association coordinated opposition among processed food producers. The Proprietary Association of America, representing the patent medicine trade, provided the most sophisticated lobbying infrastructure of any of the affected industries. The Wholesale Liquor Dealers Association represented the rectified spirits interests. These organizations did not operate through covert mechanisms. They operated through the straightforward application of financial relationships to the committee structure of Congress. And the committee structure of Congress was organized in a way that made those relationships decisive. The patent medicine industry warrants particular attention because its political infrastructure was among the most sophisticated of the period, and because the scale of harm it produced across a consumer population that included children, the elderly, and the chronically ill was among the most extensively documented in the public health record. Nostrum manufacturers, selling preparations containing alcohol at concentrations up to 40%, morphine, laudanum, cocaine, cannabis, chloral hydrate, and a range of other pharmacologically active compounds, marketed their products under brand names that implied specific curative properties for specific conditions. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which contained morphine sulfate, was marketed to mothers as a remedy for teething infants. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, which contained approximately 18% alcohol, was sold as a treatment for female complaints. Cocaine-based preparations were marketed as catarrh cures. The pharmacological properties of the active ingredients were known to the manufacturers, known to the distributors, and not disclosed to the consumers. The financial mechanism through which the patent medicine industry suppressed press coverage of these facts was documented in detail by Samuel Hopkins Adams in his Collier's Weekly series of 1904, which he titled The Great American Fraud. Adams obtained and published copies of the advertising contracts through which patent medicine manufacturers placed their accounts with newspapers across the country. The contracts contained what the industry referred to internally as red clauses, provisions stipulating that the advertising contract would become void, without payment of the remaining contracted amount, in the event that the state in which the publication operated passed legislation restricting the manufacture or sale of patent medicine products. The clause was a direct financial penalty imposed on the publisher for operating in a regulatory environment that the advertiser opposed. It converted every publisher who had signed such a contract into an active opponent of state-level food and drug legislation, not through persuasion or shared conviction, but through the simple mechanism of economic consequence. A publisher who supported reform legislation stood to lose a category of revenue that, in some markets, constituted a material portion of total advertising income. The clause did not need to be exercised frequently to be effective. Its existence was sufficient. Wiley understood the institutional architecture of the opposition with considerable precision, having spent 2 decades attempting to navigate it. His bureau had the science. The science had been published, submitted to Congress, and confirmed by subsequent research without substantive scientific challenge for more than 2 decades. What the bureau lacked was the political insulation required to convert documented findings into enacted law, because the committee structure through which food safety legislation would have to pass had been organized, through the appointment process and through the cultivation of relationships between legislators and the industries operating in their states and districts, to function as a buffer between the science and the statute. The alignment between committee assignment and the protection of food and chemical manufacturers from federal oversight was not incidental. In the relevant period, it was the organizing principle of how those committees functioned. The instrument that finally broke the legislative deadlock was not Wiley's published bulletins, not Adams's documented exposé of the patent medicine advertising system, and not the accumulated evidence of 2 decades of adulteration documentation. It was a work of fiction. Upton Sinclair published The Jungle in February of 1906. Sinclair was a socialist journalist who had spent 7 weeks in 1904 inside the Chicago Meatpacking District, employed in various capacities within the plants operated by the dominant firms of the Beef Trust. His purpose was to write about the immigrant workers who performed the labor of industrialized meat processing, to describe their wages, their working conditions, their injuries, and the systematic political powerlessness that sustained those conditions. The book executed that purpose with accuracy and considerable force. It also contained, as a subordinate element of its central argument, a description of the material that moved through those plants and into the commercial food supply. Sinclair described meat scraps swept from floors that received the accumulated contamination of a working day, sausage containing rodents that had been caught in the curing product and processed with it, workers who fell into rendering equipment and whose remains entered the supply chain as animal fat products. Some of these specific descriptions have been examined by historians against the contemporaneous inspection records of the Chicago packing houses, and found to represent a composite of observed conditions and extrapolated scenarios rather than uniformly direct testimony. Sinclair himself, in later years, acknowledged that certain passages reflected the worst-case interpretation of conditions he had observed rather than specific events he had witnessed. The industry's response to publication suggests that those who knew the packing houses best understood that the factual core of the account was accurate enough to constitute a genuine commercial threat. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Theodore Roosevelt read The Jungle and ordered an independent investigation conducted by Labor Commissioner Charles Neal and the social investigator James Reynolds. Their report, completed in May of 1906, confirmed conditions in the Chicago packing houses that, while less extreme than the most dramatic passages of Sinclair's account, were sufficient to establish that federal inspection, as it then existed, was materially inadequate to ensure the safety of meat products entering interstate commerce. That diseased and contaminated product was processed alongside sound material in the absence of reliable means of separation, and that the industry's public representations regarding its sanitary standards were false in material respects. Roosevelt used the Neal-Reynolds report as direct political leverage, communicating to the relevant congressional leadership that he would release it in its entirety unless Congress moved on both the meat inspection reform and the food purity legislation that had been blocked for 2 decades. The industry's response to this threat reveals the precise terms on which the largest producers were willing to accept regulation. The major Chicago meatpacking operations, which together controlled the dominant share of American beef processing, shifted from categorical opposition to conditional support for federal inspection. The calculation was transparent. Federal inspection conducted at government expense and carrying a federal guarantee of sanitary adequacy would eliminate the competitive advantage held by smaller regional producers who could not afford independent certification, resolve the export crisis that European governments had created by restricting American meat imports, and provide the large packers with a publicly funded system that reduced their own liability exposure. The condition was that the regulation be written to their operational and financial specifications. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 was written substantially to those specifications. Government-funded inspection, no mandatory date stamping of canned products that would require destruction of aged inventory, and preserved industry rights to judicial review of inspector condemnation decisions. The Pure Food and Drug Act, passed the same day on the 30th of June 1906, operated through a mechanism that the lobbying record explains with equal clarity. The act prohibited the sale in interstate commerce of adulterated or misbranded food and drugs, and defined adulteration in statutory terms that were the product of sustained negotiation between Wiley's bureau and the industries whose products that bureau had spent 20 years condemning. Preservatives were not prohibited. Their regulation was delegated to a referee board of consulting scientific experts, whose subsequent findings on borax, sulfurous acid, and benzoic acid were substantially more favorable to the chemical and food processing manufacturers than Wiley's own published research had supported. The burden of proof under the Act rested with the government to demonstrate that a product was harmful, not with the manufacturer to demonstrate that it was safe. That inversion of the evidentiary standard was not an oversight in drafting. It was a negotiated outcome, and it produced a regulatory framework that was structurally limited in its capacity to act on harms that were real, but whose scientific record could be contested by manufacturers with the resources to fund and publish contesting research. Harvey Wiley contested the referee board's determinations, contested the whiskey labeling decision, contested the continued availability of narcotic-containing patent medicines that the Act had technically reached but that enforcement had not, and contested the structural limitations of the law from within the Bureau until 1912, when he resigned. His departure resolved a problem for the food processing and pharmaceutical industries that his continued presence had represented, and it ended, within the bureau he had built, the most sustained period of scientific advocacy for consumer protection that the federal government had yet produced. The man whose published work had made the Pure Food and Drug Act politically possible left the regulatory institution that act had created because the act had been written to limit what his science could accomplish within it. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which replaced the 1906 framework and constituted the foundational legislation of the modern Food and Drug Administration, was itself the product of a crisis that the 1906 Act's structural limitations had made possible. A pharmaceutical manufacturer dissolved sulfanilamide in diethylene glycol because the solvent was inexpensive and produced a palatable liquid formulation suitable for pediatric use. The formulation killed 107 people before the product was recalled. Under the 1906 Act, the legal violation was a labeling technicality. The manufacturer faced no penalty for the deaths. The 1938 Act, passed in response to the disaster, required for the first time that manufacturers demonstrate the safety of new drugs before placing them on the market. That requirement was the requirement that Wiley's bureau had argued for in 1906. It was the requirement rejected in the legislative negotiation that produced the original act. The rejection was the product of the same industry pressure, applied through the same committee relationships, that had blocked all food safety legislation for the preceding 24 years. What the 1938 Act corrected, it corrected 32 years after the scientific case for the correction had been made and explicitly set aside. The lineage from Wiley's first chemical bulletins in the 1880s to the deaths of 1937 to the corrective legislation of 1938 is a continuous institutional record whose structure is consistent throughout. Each legislative episode corrected a failure that the preceding framework had been designed, in the moment of its passage, not to address. The corrections were reactive, crisis-driven, and bounded at each iteration by the same institutional pressures that had produced the original omissions. The financial architecture of the American food supply, its concentration in large integrated producers with sustained access to the legislative process, was not disrupted by any of these episodes. It was managed through them, adapted to the new requirements, and preserved in a form that continued to define the terms of what regulation could reach and what it could not. The gap between what the science had established by 1906 and what the law required is not the gap between knowledge and action in any ordinary sense. It is the gap between what the record showed and what the institutions that held the power to act could be sustained in ignoring over a period of 24 years, and what they could be limited to addressing once ignoring became no longer politically tenable. That gap was not closed in 1906. It was institutionalized in a statutory form precise enough to require another 3 decades and another mass casualty event before its most fundamental omission was corrected. The commemorative version of the Pure Food and Drug Act was not designed to contain this record. The ledger of what the American food supply held before 1906, and of what the law written to address it permitted to continue, is a record that runs from the chemical bulletins of the Bureau of Chemistry through the sulfanilamide deaths of 1937 to the food additive amendments of 1958, and into the regulatory framework that governs the American food supply today. The architecture of what is permissible was built on a foundation whose terms were set not by the science that documented the harm, but by the capital that profited from the conditions the science condemned. The ledger does not close in 1906. It continues to run on the same foundation, under different names, with different instruments, toward the same structural outcome. The urban geography of American food adulteration before 1906 was not uniform, and the record reflects the differentiation. In cities with active municipal health departments and an established tradition of public health inspection, some categories of adulteration were more constrained than in markets where no local inspection existed at any level. New York City had a milk inspection program of sorts by the 1890s, though its enforcement was inconsistent, and its reach was limited by the political relationships between the Inspection Bureau and the dairy distribution interests that had cultivated those relationships over years of strategic investment in local political campaigns. Chicago had a Board of Health whose annual reports documented the chemical composition of commercially available food products with a regularity that suggests the institution understood what was being sold in its city. The documentation existed. The regulatory consequence of the documentation was limited by the same structural factors that operated at the federal level, concentrated industry access to the political process, and the absence of any legal framework that made the documented findings actionable. The international dimension of the adulteration problem deserves examination, because it illustrates the selective application of the very standards that American industry resisted domestically. European governments, particularly Britain, Germany, and France, had developed national food purity legislation through the 1870s and 1880s that imposed requirements on imported American products that American law did not impose on those same products when sold within the United States. British pure food legislation prohibited the import of American meat products unless accompanied by certifications that American producers could not consistently provide because American law imposed no requirement that would generate the certification. German authorities periodically restricted American food imports on adulterant grounds. The American food processing industry that opposed domestic federal regulation on the grounds that it would impose costs and constrain commerce was simultaneously losing export market access because the absence of domestic regulation left it without the government certification that foreign markets required. This contradiction was not lost on the large integrated processors who ultimately supported the 1906 legislation on their own terms. The Beef Trust had lost significant European export revenue through the 1890s and into the 1900s as a direct result of European import restrictions on American meat products. The financial case for federal inspection from the perspective of Armour and Swift was not an ideological conversion to the consumer protection argument that Wiley had been making for 2 decades. It was the recognition that a federal inspection stamp, produced at government expense, was worth more in recovered export revenue than it cost in operational adjustment. The public health benefit was a byproduct of a financial calculation, not its motive. The chemical preservative question resolved itself, in the years following the Act's passage, along lines that reflect the same dynamic. Wiley's bureau had argued on the basis of experimental evidence, including a series of trials conducted on volunteer human subjects that became known in the press as the Poison Squad, that borax and boric acid, at concentrations used in commercial meat preservation, produced measurable physiological effects in healthy adult males. The referee board, reviewing the same experimental record with a different institutional mandate, found that the evidence was insufficient to support prohibition and recommended instead that the use of these preservatives be permitted at levels that the board's own members, rather than Wiley's experimental data, defined as safe. The distinction between those two positions was the distinction between a regulatory framework whose evidentiary standard was set by the science and one whose evidentiary standard was set by the negotiation. The 1906 Act produced the latter. The congressional record of the period between the Act's passage in 1906 and Wiley's resignation in 1912 documents a sustained campaign by food and chemical manufacturers to limit the enforcement authority of the Bureau of Chemistry through appropriations restrictions, jurisdictional transfers, and the interposition of the referee board between Wiley's scientific findings and any regulatory consequence those findings might otherwise have produced. The manufacturers did not challenge the science directly in most cases, because Wiley's experimental methods were defensible and his findings were reproducible. They challenged the regulatory consequence of the science, arguing that the standard for demonstrating harm should be higher than Wiley's experimental results had established, that the concentrations used commercially were lower than those shown to produce effects in experimental subjects, and that the economic disruption of restricting established preservative practices was not justified by the evidence as they interpreted it. These arguments were made not in the scientific literature, but in the committee rooms of Congress and in the offices of the Secretary of Agriculture, by men whose financial relationship with the outcome of the argument was direct and substantial. The Poison Squad trials, which Wiley had conducted beginning in 1902, using paid volunteers who consumed measured quantities of borax, formaldehyde, salicylic acid, sulfurous acid, and benzoic acid in controlled dietary conditions, and whose physiological responses were recorded by bureau physicians, represented the most systematic attempt to generate direct experimental evidence on the effects of food preservatives on human health that had yet been conducted in the United States. The trials produced findings that Wiley considered sufficient to support prohibition of the tested compounds at commercially used concentrations. The referee board reviewed the same trials and reached different conclusions. The difference was not a scientific disagreement in any technically precise sense. It was a disagreement about what standard of evidence should be required before a regulatory action was taken, and that disagreement was resolved not by the scientific community but by the political process, in favor of the standard that the affected industries preferred. The patent medicine industry's adaptation to the labeling requirements of the 1906 Act illustrated the limits of disclosure as a regulatory mechanism in a market where the consumer lacked both the technical knowledge to interpret what was disclosed and the practical ability to obtain an alternative. A preparation labeled as containing morphine sulfate in a market where the consumer required a cough remedy for a sick child and had no physician available for consultation was not meaningfully protected by the disclosure. The label told the consumer what the product contained. It did not alter the conditions that had made the product seem necessary. The nostrum manufacturers understood this. Their adaptation to the labeling requirement was therefore not a retreat from the market, but a reformulation of the marketing strategy, emphasizing the disclosed ingredients as therapeutic agents while minimizing the prominence of the disclosure itself, and continuing to reach the consumer population whose structural vulnerability to patent medicine advertising the labeling requirement had done nothing to address. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.